We begin our evening service on page 46. Page 46, as I invite us to please rise with the special recitation. Normally, right now, we would have the Shamru. Nope, we're actually going to start, let's see. Yep, that is exactly where we start. Page 46. וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה. בעלמא דברך כרותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון וביומכון וחיי לכל בית ישראל. בגלה בזמן קריב ימרו. אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריחו לעילא מן כל ברכתה בשירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה דמינא מעלמא וימרו. Amen. And now we're going to back up and do the call to worship, which we can find on page 39. Baruchu et Adonai hamevorach. Baruch Adonai mevorach leolam vaed. Baruch Adonai mevorach leolam vaed. You may be seated. We continue on page 39. Baruch Adonai leolam shebevarom arif marivim. ומעביר יום ומביא לילה, מבדיל בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו, אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד. ברוך אתה אדוני, המריב ערבים. We turn to page 40. אהבת עולם בית ישראל עמך אהבתם תורה ומצוות חוקים ומשפטים אותנו לימדתם על כן אדוני אלוהינו בשוכבנו ובקומנו נשיח בחוקיך ונשמח בדברי תורתך ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד. כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ובהם נגה יומם ולילה ואמרתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו Israel. We join together in the Shema, page 41. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובישעריך. We continue privately, page 42. והיה אם שמוע תשמעו מצותי אשר אנוכי מצווה. ויאמר אדוני אל משה לאמור, דבר אל בני ישראל ואמרת עליהם, ועשו להם ציצית על כנפי בגדיהם לדורותם, ונתנו על ציצית הכנף פתיל תכלת. והיה לכם לציצית וראיתם אותו, וזכרתם את כל מצוות אדוני ועשיתם אותם, ולא תטורו אחרי לבבכם ואחרי עיניכם אשר אתם זונים אחריהם, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. Page 43. אמת ואמונה כל זאת, וקיים עליהם כי הוא אדוני אלוהינו בעזרת. Top of page 44. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה ומרים ובני ישראל לחנו שירה בשמחה רבה, ואמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא 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 תהילות אוסף אלה. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נהדר בקודש, נורא 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 תהילות אוסף אלה. מלכותך ראו בניך, בוקע ים לפני משה, זה לי ענו ואמרו, Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nehedar b'kodesh nora nora, nora tehilot hosef ele. Adonai imloch le'olam va'ed. Mi chamocha ba'elim Adonai, mi kamocha nehedar b'kodesh nora nora, nora tehilot hosef ele, hosef ele, hosef ele. ונאמר כי פרענו את יעקב וגאלום יד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני גל ישראל. We turn to page 45 as we continue with our evening prayer for peace, praying for God to watch over us when we lie down at night and to wake us up to life renewed. Hashkivenu. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom vehamidenu malkeinu lechaim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom vehamidenu malkeinu lechaim. Ushmor tzeiteinu uvoeinu lechaim ushalom le'ata ve'ad olam. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom vehamidenu malkeinu lechaim. Hashkivenu Adonai Eloheinu leshalom vehamidenu malkeinu lechaim. Uferos aleinu sukat shalomecha baruch ata Adonai haporei sukat shalom aleinu be'al kol amo Yisrael ve'al Yerushalayim. We're going to turn ahead. We've already declared the sanctity of the festival. We'll turn ahead to page 306. 306 for the beginning of our Yom Tov Amidah. Please rise as we join together in the opening words, Adonai Svatai Tiftach. Anananananana Adonai Anananananana Svatai Tiftach Anananananana Ufi Yagid Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha Anananananana Adonai Adonai Svatai Tiftach Anananananana Ufi Yagid Ufi Yagid Tehilatecha. So the Amidah every evening is recited privately, not out loud, as opposed to every morning and afternoon. But this is going to be the same Amidah that we have for every festival service, whether it's morning, afternoon, and evening. So we're going to recite this Amidah privately, and we're going to include the very special prayer on page 309 called Vatodienu, which is the separation at the end of a Saturday night to the beginning of a festival. And then also throughout the Amidah, we're going to include all of the insertions just for Shavuot. No insertions for Shabbat or Passover or Sukkot, just the insertions. We're not there yet. We're just the insertions for Shavuot and the special prayer on page 309. Once again, we begin on page 306. Please use this time for your own private prayer through page 314. Shalom bimromav, hu yaseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru, amen. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael. We're going to remain standing. We're going to do a little bit of flipping around on the Siddur here. We're going to turn all the way back to Kaddish Shalem, which can be found on page 54. We turn back to page 54. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabba, ve'alma divra kirutei v'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon uv'imchon v'chayrecho beit Yisrael, v'agalav izman kari ve'imeru, amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach, le'alam le'almei almaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalash me'rekudja. Brichulei lamin kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'rechmata daminam ema ve'imeru. Amen. Titka batzilot onvan kon ko Israel ko dam von v'shmai ve'imeru. Amen. Yesh lama rabba min shmai v'chayim aleinu ve'al kol Israel ve'imeru. Amen. Hoseh shalom bimromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Israel ve'imeru. Amen. So it's now time for our special Kiddush for festivals. And Angela, can I invite you to get the Kiddush cup, please, and hold it. Festivals, this can be found on page 79. And then once we do the traditional festival Kiddush, we will go into our modified Havdallah, Bein Kodesh LeKodesh. And just as a preview of what's to come, the Havdallah service is not going to have the spices or Meorei Ha'esh, which is just going to do the blessing over the wine and the special Bein Kodesh LeKodesh. B'vakasha, join us. We remain standing, page 79. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol am, v'romamanu mikol hashon, v'kiddushanu b'mitzvotav. V'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu be'ahava, mo'adim lesimcha, chagim uzmanim lesason, et yom chag hashavuot hazeh, zman matan torateinu. Next page. Mikra kodesh, zecher litziat mitzrayim, kivanu v'acharta, ve'otanu kidashta mikol hamim, umoadei kodshecha, besimcha uvsason, hinchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh Yisrael ve'hazmanim. Yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, ya la la, ya la la. Yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, ya la la, ya la la. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen, borei peri hagafen, ya la 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 la. Yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, ya la la, ya la la. Yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, ya la la, ya la la. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamavdil ben kodesh lechol, ben or lechoshech. Ben Yisrael le'amim, ben Yom HaShvi'i le'sheshet yemei hamaseh. Baruch atah Adonai, hamavdil ben kodesh lekodesh. Ay lai la 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 la, ay lai la 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 la, ay lai la 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 la, ya la la, ya la la. Yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, yai lai la 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 la, ya lai la, ya lai la. And then one more bracha for the beginning of a festival. Any guesses? Yes, bottom of page 80, Shehechianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu vekimanu vehigianu lazman hazeh. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu vekimanu vehigianu lazman hazeh. Amen. Amen. One more time. Amen. L'chaim. Bevakasha. It's not a jam sheet, but it's good. It's great. Not even a Manischewitz. Okay, we now turn back for the conclusion of our service, page 56. Told you there's a lot of jumping around today. Page 56, back to Aleinu. We remain standing. Aleinu leshabeach la'adon hakol, lateit gedula leyotzeh breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpechot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, vanachnu korehim, umishtachavim, umodim, Lifnei melech malchei hamelachim hakadosh baruch hu. She'enu teshamayim yosar ha'atzma shayira. המלכות שלך היא, ולעולם תמלוך בכבוד, ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו Ushemo echad. If you're not in a period of mourning or observing a yahrzeit, you may be seated. Today we mark to the completion of the 5th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan, and in loving devotion we recall the yahrzeits of Eli Chin, Abraham Kaplan, Samid Kashfi, Ebrahim Kohanim, Isaac Matlub, Fanda Monkarsh, Shirley Norson, Isaac Rodsnier, Theodore Sutnick. And this evening begins Shavuot, the 6th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan, and in loving devotion we recall the yahrzeits of Sharam Banafshian, Shirley Cummings, Sasha Feldman, Joseph Gottlieb, Arthur Greenwald, George Kapolsnik, Doris Labelson, Herman and Antonia G. Landau and family, Louis Lawson, Isaac Meshnick, Julia Rosenbaum, Akiva Rosenbaum, Sally Rosenberg, and Belle Rubenstein. Are there any other yahrzeits or people that we are remembering today? All those in mourning or observing your yard sites, please rise as we recite the words of the Mourner's Kaddish, page 58. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei Rabba. Be'alma divra kirute v'yamnich malchute. Bechayechon uv'yomechon v'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uv'izman kari v'imru. Amen. Yehi shmei Rabba mevarach le'alam ulalmei almaya. Yit barach v'yishtabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit romam v'yit naseh. V'yit hadar v'yit ale v'yit halal shemei dekudsha. Brichu. Le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata. Tush bechata v'nechemata. Da'amiran be'alma v'imru. Amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shmaya v'chayim alenu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom bimromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom alenu ve'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen.
We're going to do a little bit of setup change, everyone at home. Okay.
Happy to flip this. Full service here.
Deans of the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, teaching, counseling, advising, and programming. In addition to her work at American Jewish University, Rabbi Peretz has served as a pulpit rabbi in synagogues, such as Los Angeles' Sinai Temple, little woo there, Adat Shalom, and Burbank Temple Emmanuel, and has been a High Holy Day guest rabbi in synagogues in Florida, California, and Texas. She teaches the broader community through in-home study groups, adult education, Talmud classes, and worldwide scholar in residence programs. She's the graduate of the double degree program between Barnard College and the Jewish Theological Seminary, where she earned degrees in mathematics, I didn't know that, and Jewish philosophy. She also holds a master's in business administration degree from Baruch College. I don't want to say most of all, but we hold her as one of our dear colleagues, one of our dear friends, and I know that we are all in for such a treat this evening as we get a chance to study with my friend and my rabbi, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz.
Rabbi for the family minyan, and this turning around at the desk and trying to figure out exactly which angle was pretty common, although then it wasn't because we were live streaming, it was because everybody wanted recordings of the B'nai Mitzvah for future. I'm sure that still happens. Nothing's changed, exactly. Ein chadash tachat hashamish. There's nothing new under the sun. But it's really great to be here, and to those of you who might be online, I believe they somehow gave a link to the text. Yes, you should have a link to the text, I'm told. Got it. So they'll make sure you have a thing for that. Great. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to be here with, you can't hear, you want me right into the microphone so they can hear me. Okay. It's really great to be here, and thank you, Rabbi Guzik and Cantor Feldman and all the clergy. It's really great to be able to be here. So, I thought that this evening, one of the reasons that we study on Erev Shavuot is because imagine if you knew that you were standing at the foot of Sinai, you were going to receive Torah in the morning, which is what we reenact when we read the Torah tomorrow morning, the section. It'd be pretty hard to sleep. And you probably wouldn't want to go to sleep because you would be afraid that you'd sleep through whatever this special moment was, just like in anticipation we do with so many other moments. Most of us probably can associate that if we have early morning flights and we're afraid of oversleeping, so we end up staying up all night. But this tradition of staying up all night and studying Torah started with literally staying up all night to make sure that you didn't miss the moment of revelation. We're not going to stay here all night. I promise I'm not keeping you that long. But I did think that we would think about what it is that happens when we receive God's Torah. And by that I mean, I want us to think beyond the intellectual tonight. I want us to think about the senses, the way in which our whole body is invited into, our whole being is invited to the experience of receiving Torah. So to do that, I want to ask you to just think about, and we're a little bit of a small group, so I might ask one or two people, and we're going to have a conversation throughout the evening. But I'll stop every little while and ask if you have questions or comments. And I really want to hear them because that'll make this more richer for all of us. But what I want to first have you think about is, what are the moments when you've been most aware of one or more of your senses? Your sense of smell, hearing, touch, sight, feeling. When in life have you been most aware of any one of your senses? Anybody? Yeah, Angela. When you gave birth, you certainly felt that, right? Yeah. Great. 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 Anyone else? Tanner Feldman. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you're healthy, first of all, and I'm glad you brought that up. And I also had that similar kind of experience last fall when I had what they thought was fluid in my ear and turned out to be something else. And that fluid in my ear made it so that I couldn't hear out of one ear. And what I experienced, and what sounds like you experienced, is what we hear from people who lose the ability or never had the ability with one sense, that the other senses are somewhat heightened, right? And that what we take for granted as every day of hearing or seeing can actually be, it can actually be really scary and can actually be debilitating when it's a ringing sound or when you can't hear it all. Rabbi Guzik. Okay, we want lots of different examples. Mm. Yeah. Mm. Great. Definitely. Definitely. That image of all the senses coming together, really important. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. The other thing that when I ask people this, usually at some point people tell me that smell evokes memory. That there's something about the smell of a family kitchen that reminds them of a moment with a parent or a grandparent or another loved one, and that it's so palpable in that moment, it's as if that person is there. And yet, it's just because somebody was cooking something, right? And they were cooking the same thing that someone cooked. It's not to belittle it, but the heightened sense of the reaction and experience of the senses evokes something much greater than just the moment. And the truth is, the Torah itself actually describes the events at Sinai using similar language. So I want to give you a little bit of context before we jump into the text that we're going to look at together. Because you may or may not know that prior to the giving of the Torah, which is in chapter 20 of Exodus, God tells Moses to get the people ready for this. And he actually tells them, I'm going to come to you in a thick cloud so that the people can hear me when I speak. That should already raise a question, right? We'll come back to that. All right, I'm going to say it again. God tells Moses, I'm going to come to you in a cloud so the people can hear me when I speak. And then Moses tells the people to do that. And then God says, go to them and warn them, and they should spend 3 days preparing. And on the third day, that's when the Torah will be given. This is a really big deal. It's not, they're wandering the desert for years and years, right? But the even with that, the idea that they're going to be receiving Torah isn't something you just walk in and do. And so much so that God says, I'm going to come in a cloud so that you can hear. That's kind of a strange idea, right? Like, what is it about a cloud that makes it so that you can hear God? Now, the commentators spend a lot of time talking about this. Some of them say it's because it's something so unusual, they'll actually pay attention to the cloud in a way that they might not have paid attention to a voice if it was coming through the visual. Some of the commentators say this is like a weird construct. Why would God say, I'm going to come in a cloud if I'm going to speak to you? Because if I'm going to speak to you, usually it's face to face. And by the way, oftentimes when I'm speaking to someone face to face, the experience of hearing them is very different than if I'm speaking to them on the phone or I'm speaking to them through some sort of shade, right? So this idea that already the Torah is being given in a cloud is something really unusual. And yet, I think it invites us to think about how is Torah an auditory, the receiving of Torah an auditory experience? How is it an experience of hearing? How is it an experience of seeing? That's just the context. So then the Torah goes on, and we get the actual 10 commandments in the beginning of chapter 20. And then the very next pasuk, the very next verse, is the one that's at the beginning of the page that you have. And if you want to take a look at it, and I'm going to just ask you, I want to make sure you know that for this first text, I'm going to be looking at the Hebrew as well as the English. I'm not trying to keep people out who don't know Hebrew, but it's essential to the questions that I want us to ask. So I'm going to point out why with each word that we look at. Okay, so the Torah says, "V'kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot." All the people saw. Here the translation is the thunder. The kolot can be the voices, the sounds. We'll come back to that in a minute. All the people ro'im et hakolot ve'et halapidim ve'kol hashofar ve'et hahar ashan v'yar ha'am v'yanunu v'yamdu merachok. So all the people saw the sounds and the lightning, the blare of the shofar or the horn, and the mountain smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and they stood at a distance. So first of all, what I want to ask you is, what, if you had to describe in one word, what's the experience the people had from what just happened? Okay, I heard seeing, I heard fire, I heard something else. Ah, interesting. Okay, yeah. Great. What's your name? Jerry, hi. Jerry, you're already jumping ahead to my next question, so just hold on to that for 1 second, right? But I want to hold on. Angela said awe. Many of the commentators see this as like they were in fear. Like imagine all of a sudden the mountain is on fire, there's blaring sounds, and they see the sounds. Now that should lead you, do you guys have the text? Did you? Okay. That should lead you to lots of other questions about this verse. How is it possible that you see sounds? Last I knew, we hear sounds, but they saw the sounds. Another thing it should lead you to ask is, why did they fall back? Right? Why was this something they couldn't stay near? Another perhaps question might be, if you look at the Hebrew, you would think that if they were talking about this happening right then, they would have said, Vayar kol ha'am et hakolot, that all the people saw. But it says, V'kol ha'am ro'im, like it happened already. So is this talking about this moment, or is this talking about before the 10 Commandments were given? So what's the moment we're talking about? And then, like Jerry said, what is it about these voices, these multiple voices? It's like everywhere else where we read about God's voice, it says kol, which is in the singular. So how is it possible, and what does it mean that we heard multiple voices? And what is that? What were those sounds? Yeah.
Wait, sorry.
Sorry. Oh,
We had a
use the microphone
unfortunately,
so people
we had a
online can
request
hear.
because they can't hear you at home. So maybe we'll just pass around the mic when we want to speak.
I have a question regarding the verb ro'im.
Yeah.
It's translated in the past, but to me it's a present or a
So
continuous.
they're seeing right now or
So,
continuous. Yeah.
so it seems to me
That's how you get for knowing biblical grammar.
it seems to me that this is an ongoing process.
Okay, so is this one moment? Is this ongoing? All these are important questions that just from the text itself, we have no way of knowing. But because we are people of the book, we know that every word in the Torah has like some distinct meaning. So you can imagine that if we have all these questions, and most of us probably consider ourselves with little knowledge of Torah, myself included, the commentators spend centuries asking these exact questions. And what I want us to do tonight is to look at what does this mean that they saw the sounds, and what does it tell us about the experience of receiving Torah? Okay? So we're going to look at, we'll see how long. You'll give me some sort of sign, Rabbi Guzik, when it's time to start wrapping up. If we don't get to them all, you'll be able to take them home and continue. But we're going to look at texts from the 1st century, the Midrash. We're going to look at texts from the Talmudic period, which is the 2nd to 5th century. We're going to look at texts from the medieval time period, from the 10th to the 15th century, and then even into the modern time. And so remember that every time a commentator is commenting, they're trying to understand, what do those words mean? How do you read that literally? The people saw the voices. Okay? Now, one other thing, the reason that you sometimes read it as the sounds or thunder, as you saw, is that those are all the same words that are used for kol. Kol is thunder, kol is sound, kol is voice, and they can mean lots of those things. Okay? So let's take a look, and let's first look at the Mechilta, which is the comments from the rabbinic period, the 1st century, written by Rabbi Ishmael. That's why it's called the Mechilta de Rabbi Ishmael. And he says, okay, here's how you understand V'kol ha'am ro'im ha'takalot. He says, ro'im ha'nir'eh ve'shom'in ha'nishma. Don't get so excited, he says. They saw what was visible and they heard what was audible. So they saw the lightning and they heard the thunder. Nothing happened here that was so unusual. You know, it's like if I said, I saw thunder and lightning, which I sometimes do, right? But I don't really mean that I saw the lightning. Saw the thunder. I heard the thunder, but I used shorthand. So don't worry about it. The Torah was just using shorthand on the one hand. On the other, he says that Rabbi Akiva says, so he's giving us a second opinion. Rabbi Akiva says, no. They actually saw what was audible, and they heard what was visible. What is he saying? Rabbi Akiva is saying the senses were completely overloaded. And what you think you can only hear, you could actually see. There's a term for this, you may have heard about it, called synesthesia. Synesthesia is when the activation of one sense automatically and involuntarily evokes a second sense. So the fact that they heard the thunder evoked the ability to see the thunder. So Rabbi Akiva says this was major interruption of normal normal experience for most people, right? I do want to say, especially as we think about inclusion, that when you talk to people who don't have one of their senses or who have conditions where the senses are heightened, like those on the spectrum, they will tell you that they hear noises that we don't hear. And it's not that they're hearing voices in their head that aren't there. It's that every sound is magnified and then changes the whole experience they're having. So Rabbi Akiva says this was like that kind of moment. But of course, the question then becomes, what if I don't have that experience every time I study Torah? Or every Shavuot? Then am I not really receiving Torah? Or what does it mean to expect that kind of miracle? Right? Because elsewhere in our tradition, it tells us, don't rely on miracles. Don't wait around, because they're not going to happen so easily. So if I'm sitting here waiting for that kind of huge magnitude experience where my senses are going to be, working in ways they don't, I may never have that. So Rabbi Akiva doesn't really answer that. And for that, we have to go to Rashi. And Rashi, of course, is the greatest commentator of the Middle Ages. And he says, yeah, they did. They actually saw that which could be heard. And he's quoting from the Midrash above. He says, but that this never happened ever before, and it'll never happen again. So what's he saying? This was a one-time miracle from God when everything shifted because the giving of Torah and the receiving of Torah was an experience so great that it called for that kind of reversal of the senses, but it'll never happen again. What does that say about the receiving of Torah? Anybody? Yeah. I use the microphone.
I don't want to monopolize the. Aren't we told that every Jew needs to feel as if they were at the revelation, that they were standing at Mount Sinai? So the giving of the Torah is supposed to be an ongoing process. When we study Torah, isn't that also a way of receiving Torah? So
Yeah.
it can't be a one-time thing.
Well, I don't think that they're saying revelation necessarily is a one-time thing. Rabbi Akiva's not saying that, or Rashi's not understanding Rabbi Akiva to say that. You're right. We at least, not everyone would say this, but we at least believe that revelation is ongoing and happens every single day. We say HaMechadesh et Tuva B'chol Yom Tamid, like that the newness comes out every single day, right? And in fact, that means that every time we hear Torah or study Torah, or live in the world, there's an opportunity for God's revelation to happen. Technology, science, medicine, those are all, to me, examples of God's continuous revelation to us. And so the question would be then, well, then how come in those moments we're not saying that, there is necessarily this ability for synesthesia, according to Rashi? So I don't think that Rashi is saying that the revelation doesn't happen. I think he's saying that original moment of revelation was so unique, so different, so grand, so unusual and unbelievable up until that point that called for some other kind of experience. And he attributes that experience as God interrupting the normal ways the senses worked in order for the human being to experience through synesthesia. But we're going to come back to your question towards the end. Yeah, Jerry. Just take the microphone from her. Yeah. Please.
From my very long ago Hebrew, which anyways, it says liro b'makom acher. Isn't makom like a place? And it's translated as occasion, so
Yeah.
it's the physical place.
Yeah. So makom can mean a physical place, and it also can mean ifshar b'makom acher, like another place in the text. Like nowhere else in the text or the teachings do we see that. So place can be a physical place or a location, but not necessarily just a physical location. Makom also, by the way, is one of the names for God. But that's not what Makom is also one of the names for God, but that's not what's being used here. Okay? All right, so let's take a look. Let's keep going because there's lots of different ways they're all trying to understand this same phrase, Kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot, that a whole nation saw the sounds. Because you got to understand the Torah, so how do we understand it, right? So we're going to go on and look at Ibn Ezra, who's a 12th century Spanish commentator. And Ibn Ezra says, I have previously explained the intent of seeing the sounds. All the sensations join together and are processed at one point. And this is the meaning when they saw the sounds and the lightning. This drove a person to be afraid, and the voice of the shofar was something never heard before, and the mountains itself was smoke. When they saw these wonders, they trembled. So what's he saying? Now he's talking not about God redirecting the senses, but he's talking about the human experience of that. When all these things blended together, all the senses blended together, they were like all they could see was smoke, right? This is basically like a motherboard overload of senses, right? Like it was just too much, right? I find sometimes when I walk into a new space, if it's really loud and there's a lot of people and there's a lot going on, like I walk in and I just am sort of overwhelmed for a moment. And of course, that's the very moment someone wants to come up to you and say, "Hi, how are you?" And I'm sort of like thinking, "Oh my God, I got to orient myself first." This, by the way, also happens to me when I walk into shul, right? Like I'm a very social being. So I walk into shul and I'm like catching who's here and what's going on. And I've got to sit down and I've come in from wherever I've been or walking or driving or whatever. And it's like, I just need to sit for a moment before I start anything. It's the reason, by the way, that in our synagogues, we're supposed to have 2 doorways till you get to the actual sanctuary. So you can orient yourself. But this is talking about, it was so overwhelming that they didn't have that chance. And it was like they didn't know what was going on in their own body. And that's why they were afraid. They didn't know what all this meant, that like everything was working all at the same time and in one moment. And it was too much. So Kliakar, the Spanish commentator the Eastern European commentator from the 16th century, he says, connected to this, he says, we have to understand how they could see the sounds. It sounds reasonable that each word God spoke became palpable and tangible to the extent that it took on physical form and could be seen in the air as floating letters as they were written in front of them. So I want you to imagine what he's saying. He's saying, the words came up, it wasn't on a page because there was no page, but the words that God spoke actually took form, physical form, and they saw them floating through the air. This reminds me, some of you may have heard the old Hasidic tale about the little boy who wants to pray but doesn't know the words. And he's standing at probably at that door. And the rabbi is trying to lead the service. And the little boy is in the back saying, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Aleph, Bet, Gimel. And the rabbi says, shh, shh. And this goes on. And finally he goes over to the little boy. He says, what are you doing? You're interrupting the service. And the little boy says, I don't know the words, but I figured if I said the letters that God would put them together and with the words, right? Now, the reason I tell you that I think of that, first of all, Kli Yakar is from the same time period that story comes from. But also, people didn't know how to read yet. This wasn't like we had the letters and they were reading from books. But somehow the symbols were so clear to them that when God spoke, it just created this image that they knew what God was saying from what they saw floating in the world, in the air. And they weren't on drugs, right? Although it might sound like it, right? Comments, questions? Yeah, Angela, go ahead.
I have a systematic question. How seriously do we have to take these commentators? I mean, some of them make a lot of sense, and some of them are just like this one is.
Yeah. And look, the beauty of looking at commentaries over the ages is they're doing exactly what we're trying to do, which is to understand the words, right? The words said all the people saw the sounds. Well, they were asking the same questions that we're asking about that. So you can decide, the commentators aren't setting down law, right? They're doing literary analysis. So you get to decide which one might speak to you more or which one speaks to you less. I think over the ages, there are sometimes where we've collectively held certain comments not to a higher standard, but to a standard, either because it speaks of a particular tradition that we've kept, or because like if it's Rashi, and Rashi is one of the most well-known commentators. So we often hold Rashi's comments as like, as central. But there are things Rashi sometimes say that I'm like, yeah, really? Like this is what you thought? Or he'll use what he calls the lingua franca, which means the language of the day. And you're like, well, that might have been the language of that day, but it's not necessarily the language of this day. So I don't when I read these, I don't necessarily look at them as, do I have to follow this? It's more, what are all the possibilities? And then what does it evoke that might be new explanations that we haven't thought of yet or that they didn't think of? Yeah, absolutely. What I also find really amazing is that we sometimes think that our modern interpretations are brand new, and actually they're often found in this, So I don't know if that helps. Okay, so yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just trying to put Ibn Ezra and Cleocar next to each other, and I'm just thinking to myself, okay, this was this pachad. This is not just, I was thinking, is it an awesome experience? Is this an awe-inspiring experience? Or is this like a haunted house? Is this like a fearful, because I was thinking when you were saying the sounds and the flashing of lights and all at the exact same time, that's actually what came to my mind, was walking through a haunted house. I like that you said shul, and I was thinking a haunted house. and I often... Yeah. That's why I don't like going into haunted houses, because it's just an overload, and I'm afraid. Yeah. I'm afraid in the moment. And when they use that word like pachad, like, do you really want Revelation to be a fearful experience? But then if you put those two commentaries next to each other, I'm hopeful that the antidote to fear are those letters of Torah that are, right in front of you. But maybe you're experiencing this moment of shock, but it's Torah that's supposed to pull you out of the shock.
Nice. Okay. So I love that drash, right? That the Torah actually draws you out of the fear, and knowing you have the Torah makes you less fearful. Really lovely drash, Rabbi. But I do want to point out a few things. One is the Hebrew does say yit pachad, like they made themselves afraid, right? They were really afraid. The second thing that I want to say is that this reminds me a lot of, I forget what they're called, but if you've ever gone to I think they're escape rooms where you go in and they're really totally black. How many of you have traveled to a country where at night it really is dark? Like this country, when we go outside, it's not really dark because we have streetlights. But I remember when I was in Africa and I walked outside and it was really dark. I mean, you could not see in front of you. Right? And when you go to an escape room, the whole idea is to give you the experience of what it's like to be blind. And when you're blind, thank God for most of us, that's temporary. But when you have to feel your way out. But there is an element that it's really cool because it's like the in thing. But if you had to do that all the time, it's really it is fear inspiring, right? It is really hard. And I think that here, what they may also be talking about is just the fear of the unknown. Remember, they didn't know they were going to receive Torah, right? They didn't know. I mean, they were told to prepare for 3 days for some sort of experience, but they had never received Torah, so they didn't really know what that meant. But the second thing is that it may well have been the fear of seeing God, because remember, we're told nobody can see God. And if they thought they were seeing God, that might have been, or even coming close to that, that could have been what was really fear-inspiring, right? And then comes the Kliyakar and says, oh, but the words were what floating, and then, there was something you were receiving. Because if it's just about that experience, think about it. If you had never ever heard of Torah or never heard of Jewish life, and somebody said, okay, from this moment on, it's yours and you have to have it. Now, of course, we don't live in that kind of society, but there is, what? What is that? I don't know what that is. I don't know if I want that. I don't know if I can deal with that. Maybe it's better not to, I don't know, right? But most of us never had to make that choice because it was just part of what we were given. Yeah, can you give the microphone? Yeah.
Hi. So I think it was in the Amidah when you had the extra verse that we added for the holiday, and on the side of it, it said something about how, they had this experience and it was terrifying and awe-inspiring and all of this. And then they were ready, like as a communal entity, they were ready to like receive the Torah and become the Jewish people, and then the Jewish people after them and after them and after them. And I think in a class I took this semester, it was like the human happiness class, and it talked a lot about awe and how that has this really like incredible, whether it's fear inspiring or like positive awe, this really incredible power to like bind people and have people, you know, their self shrink and the community strengthen. And so I think like that's kind of what the experience was, right? It's like this experience of like nothing's like what we thought it was, and now we're all here in the same collective like instance of both simultaneous like awe and fear and like all of it. And that's what made the people ready to have this tradition carry on with them.
Yeah. What's your name?
Alexis.
Alexis, thank you. Really loud. So that's okay. I've been doing the same thing. So all of a sudden I'm talking really loud into the microphone. What I love about what you just said, Alexis, is that is the experience we're invited into anew every single year, right? Or every single day, really. But let's just take every year on Shavuot, right? We're invited to receive Torah as if it was the first time we were receiving it, right? And that means that if we're really open to that receipt, there's something new in it, and something demanding in it, and something comforting in it, and something unusual, and also that can inspire fear, that can inspire awe, that can inspire trembling, that can inspire joy, right? So the Talmud actually, I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the Talmud actually talks about 5 different kinds of fear and awe. It's kind of like a spectrum between those, like, right? Because if you find something awesome, that can at the same time also be fear-inducing, right? Those aren't separate words. We don't like the word fear of God because we think that means that we're afraid for our life. But think about it. I mean, if we didn't have Torah and we didn't have God, I at least think we should fear that, right? Say that again? Well, there is. So that's what I'm saying. There are different words. So the question is, isn't there a concept of fearing God? There is, right? But modern Jews don't like the word fear of God because many modern Jews don't find that to be motivational in faith or in practice, because if God is a vengeful God to fear, then why would I want to be a part of that? I would actually say, and we can talk about this afterwards while we're having cheesecake, that those two aren't dichotomy. There's not a dichotomy between fear and awe. Like think about your own parents, right? There was probably some element of awe and some element of fear, right, at different moments. Not fear that they were going to, God forbid, hurt you, but fear of abandonment, fear of punishment, fear of authority, fear of boundaries, whatever it might be. And so that's why the Talmud says there are like actually 5 words on this spectrum between fear and awe, because awe can also inspire fear. So it's a fascinating thing. But let's talk about that during cheesecake, because I want to get to some of these other comments and then to our question for receiving Torah this Shavuot. So the next commentary, the Sforno, Spanish commentary from the 15th century, says, actually, this isn't so new. He said, this is like in the book of Ecclesiastes, when it says, "V'libi ra'ah," that my heart saw something, that they meditated on the idea of the sounds, but they were unable to endure it. And it's also like what's said in the book of Deuteronomy, let me not hear the voice of God any longer or see this fire anymore, lest I die. So what Sforno is saying is, I think, 2 things. One, he's saying this concept of seeing things that aren't usually seen is not new. We have it elsewhere in the text. We have it in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we have it in the book of Deuteronomy. And he also says that this heart-mind complex is the content of teaching in a way that it's absorbed. So think about it. In the first one, in Kohelet, he's saying, my heart saw. I meditated on it, and I got it. I saw what was there. We say that sometimes. How many of you said to someone, I see you? And I don't mean I see you. I'm saying it to someone when I'm on the phone, right? I usually mean, I get it. I get you. I hear you. Right? So he's saying, like, that's what this means. Like, that to say it meant, I understand. So, kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot, they heard it in a way that they, like, really absorbed it, meditated on it, and could see and understand it. On the other hand, hold on a second. On the other hand, he also is saying that in the book of Devarim, in the book of Deuteronomy, this experience of hearing that kind of intense voice was so intense that they had to say, like, stop, I can't handle it anymore. This intensity of hearing that, like, that deeply, seeing such that I could see it, it's too much. It's too much. The fire's too much. The smoke's too much. Like, I need space. Right? Yeah, Angela, what were you going to say?
I'm thinking that sometimes when we meditate, we go into a different state of reception of sensories. And I'm thinking maybe the revelation was something similar to that even though there was thunder and lightning and all of that the actual deliverance of the Torah was more of a transfer from soul of God to the soul of the humans, and not really actual words.
Lovely. So
I think that, as you said, most people were illiterate at the time. They couldn't read. Only people in the position of kings or scribes were able to read. So this must have been the vehicle of the transference of the Torah, in my view.
Good. So what, in essence, I hear in what you're saying, this soul-to-soul encounter between God and Moses and God and the Israelites is about an experience, right? This is... there's a famous midrash that says that really the only thing that God literally said was the Aleph of Anochi, which is the first word of the first commandment, which, if you think about Aleph, what sound does Aleph make? Well, not quite silent, but it's like breath. And so what Moses actually heard was the and the rest that midrash says is commentary, right? And Moses' interpretation. But that kind of experience of being in an encounter that leaves you changed, that leaves you maybe shaken, right? That's pretty intense. And that's, in a way, what this is talking about as well. And again, we're going to come back to what we do with all this in a few minutes. Any other comments before we go on? So I'm going to ask us to go to page 3, to the where it says, I see equals I understand. We're going to skip the Chizkuni, but we're going to come to Rabbeinu Bachya, who is also a Spanish commentator, and he's commenting on everybody's commenting on the same words. And he says, the word saw in this context is to be understood as understood or comprehended, just like when Yitzchak spoke of looking at the fragrance of his son, right? He said, look at the fragrance of my son. Well, you can't look at a fragrance, right? You smell a fragrance. He was well aware that the fragrance, just as sound, cannot be seen by the eye. He meant that just as the eye is used to understand something clearly, so he experienced a clear understanding of what his son's fragrance represented. Similarly, here, the Torah describes that the oral perceptions of the people were as convincing to them as if they had experienced the same thing with their eyes, a normally superior tool for clear perceptions, right? The meaning that they derived out of this encounter, this experience, the words, the sounds, was so clear that they understood it. It didn't matter whether it was literal or not. But it became literal because the understanding is what was literal. So the ro'im isn't intended to be, I saw with my eyes. It's intended to be like I saw with my being. I saw with my heart. I saw inside of me. I got it. I understood it. Right? For me, this one feels the biggest like the... You know, when I talk about religion to people, I always say, at some point, there's a place where rationality fails, and you take a leap of faith. Because I can argue every point that the Torah makes, or any religion, frankly, but I'll just talk about our own. I can argue why it couldn't have happened, why it's not true, why it's just a myth, but at some point, it's still what we believe, or that what we hold on to as the story of who we are. It's what I think both of our teachers, Neil Gilman, used to call the religious myth, right? A myth isn't about whether it's factually true or not, right? It's about the story that we hold on to that tells the narrative of how we live. Some of you will probably remember, I might get in trouble for mentioning this, but I'll do it anyway. Some of you may remember when Rabbi Wolpe first started here, he gave a sermon on Pesach, and he talked about the questions around the historicity of the story of the Exodus. And everybody went crazy because he said that. Right, and guess what? He's right. But the thing is that what I think people were struggling with is that's the religious myth, the religious story. It doesn't matter whether it's factually true or not. It's the story of who we are as a people and how we live our life. And without the Exodus, there is no receiving of Torah. And without the receiving of Torah, well, then the rest of it is forget it. What have we been doing for 4,000 years then? Right? So this idea that I see it, I understand it, it doesn't matter whether it was literal or not. I just get it. It's mine. I hold it. That's what this one is saying. Yeah, go ahead. Just take the microphone so they can hear. No. The people online need to hear.
People want to hear your Torah.
Thank you. So while speaking, come to my mind another verse that we have in the Bible from the Song of Song that says, "Ani yeshena velibi er." How come? If I'm asleep, how come my heart is awake?
Yeah, right. Because sometimes we're sleepwalking.
Yeah.
Right? Sometimes I am sleeping, but my heart's awake, or vice versa. My heart should be awake, but I'm not listening. Right? So, again, we're getting into when are we talking literally and when are we talking metaphorically, and what does it mean? And each one of these, though, is trying to understand the literal understanding of the kol ha'am ro'im et hakolot, that all the people saw the sounds. Because that's what the Torah said. We have to understand what it meant when it said that. So we're attempting to do that. But were you going to say something? No. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dana. I have a question. It sort of gets to what you're talking about. Do you think that back in the day, thousands of years ago, all these natural phenomenons where people thought that they were created by God, and so these stories were passed on through generations. Like, for example, when you have a tsunami, there's a receding of water similar to the parting of the Red Sea. I don't know if that was back then. They said, well, God was the explanation for all of these natural occurring phenomena.
Well, I have two different answers to that question. The first is that even the early commentators, when they talk about, for example, the plagues, gives like explanations of how each one of them could have happened that wasn't about God bringing a plague. So that's one answer. So it's been thousands of years that we've known about science. Whether the understanding of science has changed over the years, that's for sure it has, and we know different things, but we knew about science. But I also want to say, I don't see science and religion or science and miracles as distinctive, because I can live my life like nothing's a miracle, or I can live my life like every single thing is a miracle. And the fact that the things coincide to happen exactly in that moment, for your example, for a tsunami, or that they happen in such a way that it impacts over here and it doesn't impact over here, or that one person is hurt and another person's not, like all of those things aren't, I can live like I believe they're all just completely random, or I can believe like, there's a series of miracles that happen. I mean, think about it. There are, whatever number of people online and here, how many miracles had to occur for all of us to end up in this room right now at this time having this conversation. And you can say, no, I just got in my car and I drove here, or I walked here, I grew up in Los Angeles or whatever, but there's still like all the miracles of birth and life and experiences that brought us here, right? And by the way, that doesn't take away, not to get too far astray, but that doesn't take away from free will. And Maimonides was the one who introduced us to that, because Maimonides said that you can have free will and determination at the same time. Because Maimonides said that if you think about it, that God established an infinite number of ways for us to get from path A to path B. And so the free will is which ways we go to get there, right? But the fact that there is a path A and a path B, that's from God. So that sort of answers your question. We could talk more after the Well, I think it's both, and free will is I don't believe in absolute self-determination. Anyone who's had a loved one die knows that we don't have absolute self-determination, right? We don't, if nothing else, we don't have the power over life and death, right? Even with many of the modern scientific advances. I just this week buried a cousin who was really, really sick and who made the decision to exercise her right with the die to dignity law, that if two doctors independently say you have less than 6 months and it's terminal and you're in all kinds of pain, then you can choose to die with dignity through medication. And at some point, the fact that she drank the medicine and died, you could say that's absolute science, or you could say like there's still an element of exactly how it happened and when it happened, and the fact that it took, that isn't complete science. And then the only other thing I'll say, and then really we could talk about this afterwards, is that are there any doctors in the room? Because I don't want to sound like I'm insulting anyone, because I'm really not. I'm in awe of medicine, but any of us who have ever had a medical condition know that there's not an absolute science to medicine, right? There's an art to it. And they're really amazing and really skilled, and they don't know everything, right? I have this ongoing conversation with my neurological surgeon, who says to me, but how come you want me to tell you why everything happens? And when people come to you as a rabbi, you're okay saying, I can't tell you why that happens. He says, why don't I get that same opportunity from you? right? So, and he's right, but I still want him to tell me all the answers,
I
Anyway,
just want to tell you the timing. I could keep.
I know we
going
could keep
on.
going. You
It's
keep going.
I have a little bit, almost to 10, right?
Okay, so let's
Just
do
wanted to
two
let you know.
things. I want to look at two quick. Give me like 7 more minutes. Is that good?
We'll take you as long as you will give us.
And then I'm happy to stay after. But I want you to turn to page 4, where it says davar acher, which means another thing. And I used to think this was a side comment, and then the more I've been looking at it the last couple of days, the more I thought, no, it's really not a side comment, it's integral to this. And this is one of the earliest commentaries from the Shemot Rabbah, which is the commentary on the book of Exodus. And here it says, and the text says, all the people saw the sounds or the thunders. It's not written hakol, thus sound or the thunder, but rather hakolot. This is what Jerry was pointing out earlier. It's written in the plural. He says, Rabbi Yochanan teaches that when God's voice came forth at Mount Sinai, it divided itself into 70 human languages so that the whole world might understand it and every nation heard it in their own language. So what he says is that the sounds that we heard and the rumbling, the reason people got afraid was because this was the cosmic rumbling of God speaking 70 languages all at once, and each person understood it in the language they understood. And that experience of God doing that in a singular moment was so grand that it caused this rumbling and thunder and lightning, and people saw that, experienced that. So, yes, please, hi.
But at that time in the Sinai, when Moses was with Israelite in the Sinai, there were only one kind of people there that they spoke only the Egyptian language. They didn't.
Correct.
God didn't need 70 languages to
Yes.
speak. Only one language were enough.
Yes, except that we say that God gave the Torah in Hebrew, and they didn't yet know Hebrew. So it's all the more reason that it had to have been automatically interpreted into other languages as well. Yeah. They didn't know Hebrew.
The point is that there was a uniform people, so we didn't
Seemingly-
need 70 languages.
Seemingly, but I think what this midrashis is saying is that that this was also a moment that transcended time and space, right?
That's
So
it,
it was
because
all the people in every moment, just like we say we were all standing at Sinai, right? So God said it in English at that time that we would hear it, and in the cosmic world, it didn't matter if it was the same moment or not.
That's it, because we're always
Yep.
receiving the Torah.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to, the last text I want to look at, and then I want to ask you a final question. Look up above at Abraham Joshua Heschel. And Abraham Joshua, 20th century, amazing modern Jewish thinker, who says, God, not an emotion, a stir within us, but a power, a marvel beyond us, tearing the world apart. The word that means more than the universe, more than eternity, holy, holy, holy. We cannot comprehend it. We can only know it means infinitely more than we are able to echo. Tagged, embarrassed, we stammer and say, He, I would say God, he said he, who is more than all there is, who speaks through the ineffable, whose question is more than our mind can answer, he to whom our life can be the spelling of an answer. And so what I want to ask us for this Shavuot is really to hold this idea of seeing the sounds, of engaging our senses, and to quiet if you need to, or maybe you need to magnify it, that's for you to determine, but to really be aware of the way in which seeing Torah purely as intellectual limits us. But when we stand, whether it's figuratively tonight or tomorrow morning, and we read about that moment of revelation, right? Close your eyes, open your ears, like pull out your fingers, right? Have food in front of you and smell the delicious dairy food that you'll eat, whatever it is, and realize that Torah is about engaging our entire self. And ultimately, that, I think, is what makes Torah enduring and makes our life so meaningful. And so I want to bless us all with that kind of receiving of Torah, and to be continuing to not just sit here in Cone Chapel together, but to be standing at the foot of the mountain together to receive Torah as well, which means to hold each other's senses as well. Chag Sameach.
It's such a beautiful, beautiful lesson for all of us. I know that I represent everyone here and everyone at home with a yasher koach to our rabbi, our colleague, our teacher. You unlocked all of our senses tonight. You really did. And I throughout the study, I kept thinking this is also just such a challenge for us, right? In a beautiful way. This is a challenge to hold on to as you said so eloquently, to not just have the verses here reading every once in a while, but really living Torah on a daily basis, moment to moment. So thank you. And we will engage the sense that we didn't really speak about so much tonight, and that's our taste. So I hope you'll all join us in Gold Hall. I think we have like 10 full cheesecakes. So I'm actually going to take a few of them away. Yeah, we can, and I'm going to put it away for tomorrow morning. If you'd like to join us for services tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. back here in Cone Chapel. And I think I'm going to take like 5 of those cheesecakes, put them in the refrigerator so we can have them after shul tomorrow too. Thank you everyone for joining us, and Yasher Koach.